Truth. Un, 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 un,
Unforbidden.
truth. Podcast.
Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. Today I'll be speaking with Kathy Williams. Kathy is a former correctional officer at the Douglas County Jail and Tecumseh Prison in Nebraska. She speaks about working with death row inmates in the prison, the everyday tasks and duties of a correctional officer, and an incident in which she was harassed by a former inmate, which made her quit her job as an officer and seek employment elsewhere after being terrified from the incident. Here's my interview with former correctional officer Kathy Williams. Can you introduce yourself and give me a little background?
Yeah, my name is Kathy Williams. I worked at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution in Tecumseh, Nebraska, and the Douglas County Jail in Omaha, Nebraska in 2013 and 2014.
What was your official title while working for DOC in the jail?
At the prison, I was a correctional officer and then a corporal. At the jail, I was just an officer.
And what facility would you say that was more hardcore? Would you say it was the prison or the jail?
The jail for me was harder.
What was the difference between working at the prison and jail that made you think that it was a bit harder?
At the prison, everybody was settled. They had their sentence. They, didn't come straight off the street, so they didn't. Most of them weren't on, drugs or alcohol still. They weren't coming down off of anything. They'd pretty much accepted their future there and had settled in where they, belonged. But at the jail, everybody, for the most part, when they're coming straight off the street, they're on something or they're still mentally dealing with something. And so it was just more, you didn't know what you were going to experience at the jail.
So death row inmates are housed at the Tecumseh prison. Did you have any interactions with the death row inmates there?
I did. I escorted nurses in for meds. Escorted the inmates from death row to, they had gym time sometimes. I think I took them to the library one time. I worked in they called it the bubble, in the control center for the death row.
So one of my biggest interviews to date was with Nico Jenkins, who's on death row in Nebraska. Did you have any interactions with him while you were working?
When I worked at the Douglas County Jail, that's when soon after he had been arrested. So he wasn't at the death row yet. He hadn't gone to all of his trials and been sentenced yet. I saw him in the hall, but I didn't ever speak directly with him. I did work in the unit with his sister and his mom, and then I had also worked in the uh, the medical unit with his sister when she was moved there.
When you were working when he was there, did you ever hear like any outbursts or any like random things that he might have been doing or
There was nothing too crazy at the jail when I was there. He wasn't there too long when I was there. I was in training. So by the time I was on the floors when he had been moved. But I did hear a lot about him, and I had read some reports about his history when he had been incarcerated at the prison previously.
what were your everyday tasks and expectations as a correctional officer?
At the prison, it was wherever I was assigned. I worked in the gym for a while, so I would open up the gym. I would supervise inmates in there, worked the lunch lines. We had to do cell searches, pat downs on inmates, or if I worked in the control center, it was keeping an eye on the unit. It was buzzing doors, getting them up for visits or work. Um, if I was on the yard, escorting inmates where they needed to go. I worked in the library. Sometimes I worked in the church area sometimes. I've worked in the tower in the perimeter there. At the jail, for the most part, I was in units. Occasionally, I was working. Um, I would work in the halls. I can't even remember what, but I would work transporting inmates from unit to unit or taking them down to booking to get booked out or bringing inmates up.
Were you ever put in any like sticky situations where you felt uneasy or uncomfortable with anybody?
Yeah, so I worked in a male unit for a while, and I had two inmates get in a fight in there, and so I had to call a code on that, and that was my first time having a fight, and so I actually walked down in between the inmates to try to separate them, which looking back that was really dumb, but that was probably dumb, but they stopped as soon as I did, so they didn't do anything crazy. But the one inmate that stayed in my unit after, I guess, was pretty angry at me for calling the code on them. And so he made a few threats until he got moved out of my unit. And then I had another inmate, actually, the reason that I quit in corrections. When he got out, he saw me at Walmart with my now husband and he was my boyfriend. Um, and he followed me around Walmart. He had a few friends with him, and he kept making statements about when I was a CO when he was in the jail, and saying that I wasn't so tough now that I wasn't at the jail, and he was mad because he had been written up a few times. Just a young kid that he felt disrespected because he had been written up for behavior in the unit. So that is actually the when I started applying for other jobs and realized I wasn't really cut out to do this long term, just because I had a family and I felt like once it followed me outside of the jail, and I felt like that made me open my eyes that it was more dangerous than I thought.
How did you handle that situation with that man like stalking you and harassing you in the Walmart?
So we tried, well, when he first came up to me, because he confronted me, I was like, hey, I'm glad you're out, make sure you stay out. Because I always tried to stay positive with him and, give respect to get respect. But he had felt disrespected from being locked down. So I just kind of tried to end it there. And with my boyfriend, we walked away and we were trying to lose him in different aisles, kind of going through aisles we didn't need to be just to try to like lose them. And he just kept following me and was yelling things from like the next aisle over. They followed us all the way till we checked out up front, and then I didn't want to go outside to my car, so we went to an employee and had them call the police. The police came up and escorted us to my car, but they had left by the time the police got there. I guess he had a warrant, but he was gone before they got there.
Was that the only like situation in which a former inmate like recognized you and was like harassing you?
Yeah, that's the only harassing one. I've had inmates that I've seen outside a couple of other times, but it's always been pretty positive and short. Hey, glad you're out, stay out, but nothing ever harassing after that.
What was your overall experience working with the prisoners?
At the prison is actually probably the best job I've ever had. The camaraderie with my employees was something I've never experienced. Most of the prisoners were very friendly to me. I think as a female, of course, they were going to be friendlier. Some of them were angry that they were there and angry if they felt like you disrespected them if you ever wrote them up for anything or stopped them for a pat down. But probably 90% of the inmates that I encountered were friendly to me, and they were always taught to give respect, to get respect from them. Obviously, until something happens and you can't, but always approach it giving respect. So that's always how I approached everything. And so most of them were friendly. I had some older inmates tell me, "We'd always have your back because you treat us well." But I also had inmates that were part of the Aryan Nation, I think. I'm not sure which specific group, but one of those groups that got mad at me for one write up. And so they would yell things across the yard. And there were occasionally inmates that would just do that because just yell inappropriate things. But I would say 90% of the time it was a pretty positive experience.
So prior to working with prisoners, did you have any type of preconceived notions about them or the prison system that might have changed your mind or remained the same for that matter?
Yeah, I was actually shocked how free they were at the prison, just walking the yard and all the programs that they had in the units. They were out most of the day. They had rec time. They had, a baseball field, a basketball court. They had an indoor gym. They had, big weight sets, and they had just programs everywhere. So I was actually surprised how much they had that they could do. And I honestly was terrified before going in. The first day that we went to the prison, I was so scared. I didn't want to be there. But after working there for a week or so, you realize like these are people, these aren't, these aren't monsters that are just in here ready to kill you. Most of them are decent people that screwed up, there's a lot of drug charges and things like that. And so, you have to keep your guard up, obviously, but at the same time, you realize these aren't just machines that are in here, people that have committed awful things and are just out to kill everybody they see. They're actually people that, if you are respectful toward them, they're going to treat you the same way.
Did you have any like views on the death penalty before working with death row inmates?
Yeah, I have always had the view, I support the death penalty. I know there are situations where people are convicted with, you know, the wrong information or like my brain is not working. False confessions. And so I know that happens and I know that's a really hard subject to get around, but I still pretty strongly support the death penalty.
What was the typical protocol to follow, say, when a lockdown went into effect, or before a lockdown went into effect, I should say?
Um, Generally, we didn't know about it ahead of time. It would get called over the radio. If I was working in the unit, in the control center, I would make sure the doors were all, locked. I would make sure my unit didn't have anybody hiding out. If I was working on the yard, then I would come in and help get inmates into their cells if they weren't wanting to lock down fast enough. Make sure nobody's on the yard, make sure nobody's in the extra areas like the chapel or the library. But there weren't too many extra lockdowns called. I mean, occasionally, but for the most part, it was only the scheduled lockdowns.
So were you ever on shift when like a riot broke out or a homicide happened or anything crazy like that, other than like the typical assault?
I was when, I mean, there was a fight. The guy had what they said a lock in his sock. But I didn't go to that call. I was working in the gym, and so I couldn't leave my post. But and the only other time was when there was a suicide. But I actually quit the year before they had some big riots in May where there were some homicides, and so I wasn't there at that time. I never saw anything that crazy there.
Are you familiar with what the process was like for suicide attempts or suicide, when it came to like everything that went into I guess your job duties?
I mean, the first thing would be obviously to try to make sure everything was secure. You don't just run into this to the cell because you don't know if it's a setup, but you also need to make sure you get help there immediately. Um, and other than that, make sure that everybody locks down as soon as that happens so that nobody can mess with anything. Make sure that the cell is secured after the person is given the help that they need. And that way the investigation can take place. But I was never specifically involved in that. I was working in the gatehouse when that happened, so I didn't see it happen or respond to it. But I know that we would have locked the rest of the unit down. I'm sure the rest of the prison was locked down, but I can't specifically remember. And they had medical come in. They had a team come in to try to get to the guy, and then they secured his cell so that they could do their investigation and see what happened.
Were there many suicides or homicides either in the jail or prison while you worked there, whether you were on shift or not at the time?
The only one that I know of is the one that happened while I was on shift, the suicide. There really weren't that many. There were no homicides, but when I was there, and I think there was just the one suicide.
So on a scale from 1 to 10, what would you say the stress level was like working at a jail versus a prison?
I would say the jail was probably 7, maybe 8. It wasn't super stressful all the time, but when it was stressful, it was a lot more stressful. And you just never knew what to expect. They say keep your head on a swivel, and that is so much more important at the jail. I mean, it's so important no matter where you're at, but at the jail, it's just so much more unsettled. Everybody's coming from somewhere different. Nobody's really settled with each other or accepted what they're going through. they have the emotions, they have every other thing going on, and they're just unpredictable. But at the prison, I would say, it was still, 4 or 5, especially if you worked in the SEG unit, it was a lot higher because the inmates were definitely a lot, a lot more, I don't know, unpredictable there. They would do a lot more. They would be willing to do a lot more because they were already locked down as far as they could be. But on the yard, probably like a 4, just because you had to still be watching your back. You still obviously couldn't just settle down and calm down and expect nothing to happen, but it just was so much more settled because everybody had already gone through the court system. They already knew what their fate was, and most of them weren't coming down off of something.
Do you feel like you've learned anything, important or of value working for a Department of Corrections?
Absolutely. Not judging people, based on, you know, what they look like, what their charges are, what their history is. People can definitely change if they want to, but people aren't going to change if they don't want to. Um, I think I grew up a lot in that time. I was very naive and sheltered as a kid, so going through that, it was just seeing what people were capable of in the real world, and people aren't just all good, but people aren't just all bad either. So just, I don't know, it changed my view of the world, but not necessarily all in a bad way.
So, before we get out of here, is there anything that you'd like to end with, whether that be about your work as a correctional officer or what it was like working for the Department of Corrections?
I would say I think it was a very positive experience, and I know, in movies, there's always kind of a bad light shed on correctional officers, but I would say 99% of the people that I worked with were the best people I've ever known. And there were definitely a few that didn't belong there. And that always came out eventually. But I would say most of them were really good people that were just there to do their job, but also cared about the people that they were there for. You definitely had a few bad eggs, and I think that's with any profession, but I think overall they cared about the inmates, whether it was specific inmates or just in general trying to do their best at their job. And also the inmates aren't always as crazy as they want to make themselves seem. Sometimes it's for attention, and they're definitely not all bad either. There's a lot of good people that just made mistakes in there.
Awesome. Well, thank you for giving me your time and giving me your perspective. This is actually the first perspective of a prison worker I've actually got, so I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for letting me be on here. I'm glad to have the chance.
That was my interview with former correctional officer Kathy Williams. To stay up to date with everything Unforbidden Truth, head on over to unforbidden-truth-podcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
Unforbidden.
Truth. Unforbidden.